Ethan Carter didn't consider himself a prideful man. At 38 years old, he had built a life that most people would envy, a quiet, well-kept house in a nice neighborhood, a luxury car he rarely boasted about, and a career that had elevated him from his modest beginnings into a man who earned well beyond the American dream. He never flaunted the wealth that came with it, and perhaps that was the beginning of his story. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. The first chill of fall swept through the streets of Boston as Ethan stood at his usual spot in the kitchen, a fresh cup of coffee warming his hands. His wife, Sabrina, moved about the house, completely engrossed in a world she seemed to share with no one but herself. The distant sound of her heels against the hardwood floors echoed sharply, breaking the silence he had grown so familiar with. Ethan sipped his coffee, his sharp eyes following her movements as she rushed from room to room. She was always busy now, too busy for him. "Where are you off to today?" Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. Sabrina barely glanced at him as she adjusted the silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, her dark hair catching the morning light. "Meeting Clara for lunch," she said, her tone clipped, almost rehearsed. "Then the boutique needs me to check on some new arrivals." Ethan gave a faint smile. "You're becoming quite the socialite." Sabrina stopped in her tracks and shot him a look he couldn't read. There had been more of those looks lately, sharp and searching, as though she was measuring him for something. "Don't wait up for dinner," she said. "I'm sure you'll find something to do." Something to do. Ethan didn't miss the slight edge in her voice, the way the words fell from her lips like shards of glass. Something had shifted in their marriage, though neither of them had dared speak it aloud. It was subtle, like cracks forming in a beautiful porcelain vase. Sabrina wasn't the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago, the woman who'd once believed in him when he was little more than a struggling financial analyst. He still remembered the days when they would laugh over takeout and cheap wine, the glow of their tiny apartment making even their struggles feel romantic. Now, the silence was louder than the laughter had ever been. Sabrina was the kind of woman who made an impression. With a striking presence and an aura of quiet elegance, she carried herself like someone who deserved to be admired. She wasn't cruel, but over the years, her patience had frayed like a worn thread. Ethan knew it. He had noticed the way she stared at the lives of others through the window of social media, the women with larger houses, the men who took their wives to Paris just because it was a Tuesday. There was a hunger in her, one that Ethan used to try to satisfy but could no longer keep up with. Maybe that's why she'd begun saying things that stung him more than he cared to admit. "I don't need a poor man," Sabrina had told him 2 weeks ago during an argument. He hadn't been prepared for it. The words had landed like a slap, and even now, they lingered. Ethan hadn't corrected her then. In truth, he hadn't known how to. Because the truth was far stranger than fiction, Ethan Carter, the man she considered barely getting by, earned over $1 million a year. And she had no idea. He had built his fortune slowly, starting with quiet investments in undervalued stocks and real estate during the early years of their marriage. He had been smart and cautious, hiding his growing wealth behind modest habits and bank accounts she didn't know existed. It wasn't about greed, at least not at first. It had been about security. Stability. He had grown up watching his parents fight over bills, each day a battle to keep the lights on. Ethan had sworn never to live that way, and he never wanted his wife to know that kind of fear either. But somewhere along the way, his silence had become his shield. Now, as he stood in the kitchen, watching Sabrina's car disappear down the driveway, Ethan felt something strange stir inside him. Guilt? Maybe. Regret? Definitely. But there was something else, too, a gnawing unease. He had built his life around the illusion of a simple man. But the illusion was cracking. And he wasn't sure what would be left of it once the truth came to light. That evening, Ethan sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the television doing little to fill the emptiness of the house. Sabrina hadn't come home for dinner, just as she'd said. He glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Out of habit, Ethan opened his laptop and pulled up the financial spreadsheets that tracked his investments. Numbers had always been comforting to him. They didn't lie, didn't change. The market could crash, and people could betray you, but numbers? Numbers told the truth. As he scanned the data, his phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen, "Sabrina, I'll be home late." Don't wait up. Ethan stared at the words for a long moment before typing a brief reply. Okay. But he didn't feel okay. He closed the laptop and let his mind wander. The numbers on the screen, the fortune he had amassed, felt hollow tonight. What was the point of building a life if the person you were building it for didn't even see you? The next morning, Ethan woke to find Sabrina's side of the bed empty, the sheets cold. She was already gone. There was a note on the kitchen table, her delicate handwriting stark against the white paper. I'll be out for a few days. Staying with Clara. Don't call me. Something heavy settled in Ethan's chest as he stared at the words. This was no longer the subtle unraveling of a marriage, it was something more. Sabrina was leaving him in pieces, and she didn't even have the decency to look him in the eye while she did it. As he crumpled the note in his fist, a thought occurred to him, one so strange and dark that he couldn't believe it had come from his own mind. What if she doesn't come back? Ethan didn't know how to feel about that. He had spent years convincing himself that their marriage was worth saving, that their love was simply hibernating beneath the surface, waiting to be woken. But what if he had been wrong? What if the silence wasn't temporary? What if Sabrina didn't want to be saved? He shook the thought away and reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over her contact before he pulled back, letting the device drop onto the table. She had said not to call. And for the first time in their marriage, Ethan didn't. Instead, he grabbed his keys and left the house, his thoughts a storm of questions he didn't want to answer. He needed a distraction, something to keep his mind occupied while the truth gnawed at the edges of his sanity. But as Ethan drove aimlessly through the city, past the restaurants where he and Sabrina used to laugh and the parks where they had once talked about their future, he realized that distractions wouldn't help him this time. He had built a life on secrets. And now, it was all beginning to unravel. The next few days passed like a haze, every moment heavy with the knowledge that something had shifted irreversibly. Sabrina had not returned. Ethan hadn't called, respecting her curt instructions. Yet the silence in the house wasn't one of peace, it was loud, oppressive, and filled with unanswered questions. By the third day, Ethan found himself back at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop. Numbers usually soothed him, calmed his mind into logical order. But not now. Not when his life felt like it was spinning beyond his control. His phone sat nearby, still silent, its blank screen mocking him. Finally, he decided to act. The truth had to come to light, not for revenge or pride, but because the silence between them had gone on too long. He grabbed his coat, picked up his keys, and left the house. Ethan's first stop was Clara's house. Sabrina had said she was staying there. Clara, Sabrina's closest friend, was the type of woman who always smiled too much and said too little. Ethan never trusted her, though Sabrina insisted her loyalty was unwavering. As he pulled up to the brownstone, Ethan hesitated for a moment, hands gripping the wheel. He was not a confrontational man by nature. But this wasn't about confrontation, it was about clarity. He climbed out of the car and approached the door, his steps deliberate and heavy. Clara answered on the second knock. Her face, painted with a mixture of surprise and discomfort, was enough to tell Ethan that something wasn't right. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "What are you doing here?" He kept his tone even. "Is Sabrina here?" Clara froze for a beat too long before shaking her head. No, she isn't." Ethan tilted his head, his gaze locking onto hers. "She told me she was staying with you." A flush crept up Clara's neck. She was staying here. But she left yesterday. Didn't she tell you?" Ethan's gut twisted at her hesitation. "Where did she go?" "I don't know," Clara replied quickly. Too quickly. "She didn't say." Ethan studied her face, noting the tightness in her smile and the way her eyes darted toward the floor. He had been around long enough to recognize a lie when he heard one. "Clara," he said softly, though his words carried weight, "you're a terrible liar." Clara's smile faltered. "Ethan, please, I don't want to be in the middle of this." "You already are," he replied sharply. "Tell me where she went." For a moment, Clara looked as though she might slam the door in his face. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the look in Ethan's eyes, the quiet desperation of a man who had given everything to a marriage built on cracks. Clara sighed, stepping back slightly to lean against the doorframe. She didn't go far, she admitted reluctantly. She's at a hotel downtown. The Fairmont. Room 725. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs, his suspicion confirmed. A hotel. It was the answer he didn't want. Why? He asked, his voice hoarse. Clara didn't answer, her gaze falling to the floor. Ethan turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, still clutching the door as though it might shield her from the storm brewing. The drive to the Fairmont was a blur. Ethan couldn't feel his hands on the wheel or the tension coiling like a snake in his chest. He parked a block away, needing a moment to collect himself. A hotel. It could mean anything. Sabrina might have needed space, time to think, a break from the suffocating silence of their marriage. But deep down, he knew better. People didn't hide in luxury hotel rooms unless there was something, or someone, they were hiding from. Ethan's feet felt like lead as he walked through the polished lobby of the Fairmont. The opulence felt out of place, too glamorous, too foreign to the quiet simplicity of his own life. He approached the front desk, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Room 725. Sabrina Carter, he said, pulling out his ID. I'm her husband. The clerk hesitated, but something about Ethan's calm resolve must have convinced him. Of course, sir. A keycard slid across the marble counter. Ethan took it, nodded his thanks, and made his way to the elevator. Each floor that ticked by felt like another layer of his world peeling away. By the time he reached the 7th floor, his heart was a hammer against his ribs. Room 725 loomed at the end of the hallway. Ethan approached it slowly, the corridor eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of distant voices and faint music from behind other doors. He paused in front of Sabrina's room, his hand hovering over the handle, the keycard gripped tightly in his other hand. This was the moment, he realized. The moment when his silence would shatter, and the truth would finally confront them both. He slid the keycard through the lock. The green light flashed, and the door clicked open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn to block the midday sun. A suitcase sat open on the bed, clothes spilling over the edges in hurried disarray. The air smelled faintly of Sabrina's perfume, and something else, something sharp, like betrayal. Then he heard it, the murmur of voices from the adjoining room. Ethan's breath caught as he moved toward the sound, his footsteps careful, his pulse roaring in his ears. The door to the adjoining suite was ajar, just enough to see inside. And there she was. Sabrina sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Opposite her sat a man Ethan didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, and too comfortable in the space between them. You don't understand, Mark, Sabrina was saying, her voice strained. He doesn't know. He never asks questions. He never even suspects. The man, Mark, sighed, running a hand through his hair. Sabrina, this is dangerous. If he finds out, if he knows you've been seeing me while. He won't, she interrupted quickly, almost desperately. He can't. Ethan stepped into the room then, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I can't what, Sabrina? Sabrina's head whipped around, her face draining of color as she stared at him in shock. Ethan, what are you doing here? Ethan ignored her question, his gaze shifting to Mark. The man stood abruptly, clearly uncomfortable under Ethan's piercing stare. And you must be Mark, Ethan said coldly. How long has this been going on? Sabrina jumped to her feet, her voice high and defensive. Ethan, stop. You have no right to. I have every right, Ethan said sharply, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. I'm your husband, or have you forgotten that while you've been hiding in hotel rooms with strangers? Sabrina flinched as though the words had struck her. Mark took a step back, clearly recognizing the fury radiating from Ethan's otherwise composed figure. Get out, Ethan said to him, his voice dangerously low. Now. Mark hesitated, looking at Sabrina for confirmation, but Ethan's stare left no room for argument. Without a word, Mark grabbed his coat and left, brushing past Ethan as he disappeared into the hallway. The room fell into silence. Sabrina stood motionless, her eyes locked on Ethan's as though trying to read his next move. Ethan. How long? Ethan cut her off, his voice hoarse. Tell me the truth, Sabrina. How long has this been happening? She swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes. It's not what you think. How long? He demanded, the anger finally breaking free. Sabrina's voice trembled as she whispered, 6 months. Ethan closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a punch to the chest. 6 months. Half a year of lies. Half a year of sharing his wife with another man while he sat in their home, blissfully unaware. When he opened his eyes again, the hurt was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. You don't need a poor man, Sabrina, he said quietly, his voice laced with bitterness. You might want to rethink that. What? She asked, confusion flashing across her face. Ethan stepped closer, his expression unreadable. You have no idea who I really am. For the first time, Sabrina looked afraid. Ethan had walked out of the hotel suite that day with quiet finality, his footsteps echoing in the hollow corridor. Sabrina had called his name, her voice tight with panic, but he hadn't turned back. There was nothing left to say. He didn't yell, didn't rage, he simply vanished, and in that silence, Sabrina knew she had lost him. The divorce papers came a week later, delivered to her doorstep in a sleek envelope, cold and clinical. Ethan hadn't even included a personal note, just the brutal efficiency of a man tying off a loose end. The proceedings were swift, like a bandage ripped clean. Sabrina had thought she might fight for something, money, their house, anything, but Ethan made it clear there was no need. Their modest home, the savings accounts, the car, all of it had been left to her without a fight. It confused her, even unsettled her. She had assumed Ethan's calm demeanor hid a storm of vengeful intent. But instead, he was letting her go, washing his hands of her entirely. You're free to move on, his lawyer told her curtly when she asked. He has no interest in contesting anything. Sabrina signed the papers with trembling hands, unable to shake the feeling that the man she had so thoroughly underestimated had slipped through her fingers like sand. 6 months later. Life moved forward for Sabrina, though not without difficulty. After the divorce, Mark had become a larger presence in her life. At first, she wasn't sure what to make of him. Their affair had been thrilling, dangerous even, but in the light of day, stripped of secrecy, the excitement had dimmed. Mark was charming, of course, but he lacked Ethan's quiet stability, his unwavering patience. Still, Sabrina clung to Mark because she didn't want to face the alternative, being alone. The months blurred together, and by spring, Mark proposed. It wasn't romantic, not like the way Ethan had once planned his proposal with candlelit dinners and handwritten notes. Mark simply held out a small, polished ring at their favorite restaurant and said, "Why not make this official?" Sabrina hesitated for only a moment before saying yes. It wasn't the kind of overwhelming love she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was something that felt familiar, comfortable, like slipping on an old coat. And so, Sabrina married Mark in a small ceremony at a courthouse, surrounded by acquaintances and distant family members. There was no honeymoon, no giddy excitement, but she told herself it didn't matter. This was practical, and practical was enough. The call. It happened a month after the wedding. Sabrina was sitting on the couch of their rented apartment, flipping through bills, when her phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and she nearly ignored it. But something made her answer. "Hello?" she said, distracted. There was a pause, and then a familiar voice, deep and calm, spoke on the other end. "Sabrina." Her breath caught in her throat. She almost dropped the phone. "Ethan?" "Yes," he said. The way he said it, so simple, so steady, sent a shiver down her spine. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Sabrina sat up straight, clutching the phone tightly. "No. No, you're not interrupting. How are you? Where are you?" Ethan's voice remained cool and measured. "I've been doing well," he said. "Better than I ever have, actually. I wanted to tell you something. I thought you deserved to know." She felt a strange unease settle over her. "What is it?" "I earned over $1 million this year," Ethan said, his tone casual but pointed. "Turns out, I've done pretty well for myself." Sabrina froze, the words slamming into her like a blow. "What?" she whispered, not sure she'd heard him right. I make $1 million a year, Ethan repeated. I always have, Sabrina. Even back then, when you thought I was barely getting by. Her heart raced in her chest. You're lying, she said, though the words sounded hollow. That can't be true. You didn't know me as well as you thought, Ethan said quietly. But now you do. I wanted you to hear it from me. Why are you telling me this? She choked out, her voice shaking. Are you trying to humiliate me? No, he replied. I'm just giving you the truth you never cared to ask for. Sabrina's mind spun wildly. $1 million? Ethan had been hiding this from her. All the time she'd accused him of being small, of not being enough, he had silently built a fortune behind her back. Ethan, please, she said softly, the words coming out before she could stop them. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I never meant to. To leave me, he finished for her. You did. And I let you. There was a long pause. Sabrina could hear her own breathing, uneven and shallow. Ethan, can we talk about this? Please. I made a mistake. Ethan's laugh was soft, bitter. It's too late for that. Please, Sabrina said, her voice breaking. We can fix this. I can fix this. I was blind, Ethan. I didn't see what I had. I see it now. I swear. Ethan didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and distant, like a man who had already moved far beyond her. You see it now because you lost it, Sabrina, he said. And that's not love, that's regret. Tears slid down her face as she clutched the phone, desperate for something to hold on to. Ethan, please don't do this. I love you. I miss you. You love the idea of something better, Ethan said softly. And now that you know what you lost, you're trying to get it back. But you don't get to rewrite the past. Goodbye, Sabrina. Ethan, wait. The line went dead. Sabrina sat in the quiet living room, the phone slipping from her hand. She stared blankly at the wall as the weight of what had happened crushed her. Ethan, a man she dismissed, betrayed, and discarded, had risen far beyond anything she had ever imagined. And now, there was no going back. When Mark came home that evening, he found her sitting on the couch, staring into space. Hey, he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Sabrina turned to him slowly, taking in the man she had chosen. He was handsome, sure, but ordinary. A manager with a modest salary. A man who couldn't hold a candle to the quiet strength and brilliance of Ethan Carter. I'm fine, she said quietly, though inside, she was anything but fine. Mark kissed her cheek and disappeared into the kitchen, humming a song under his breath. Sabrina sat alone, the sound grating against her ears as she realized the truth. She had gambled everything for a fleeting moment of excitement and lost. Ethan had been the man she needed all along. And now, he was gone. Months passed, and life for Sabrina became a shadow of what it had once been. She went through the motions of her new marriage to Mark, a marriage built not on love, but on convenience and denial. Mark, for all his charm, was beginning to show his true colors. His temper simmered beneath the surface, and his steady job and modest salary suddenly felt claustrophobic. The man Sabrina had once thought of as her escape had turned into another disappointment. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, Ethan's voice haunted her. You see it now because you lost it, Sabrina. Those words gnawed at her, clawing through her dreams and burrowing into her waking thoughts. It wasn't just about the money. No, it was far deeper than that. Ethan's quiet strength, his devotion, his ability to persevere even when she hadn't believed in him, it was all gone. And she had thrown it away with her own hands. Late one evening, when Mark was snoring beside her in their cramped townhouse bedroom, Sabrina lay staring at the ceiling, suffocated by regret. The walls felt closer than ever, trapping her in a life that was unraveling at the seams. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. 2 months later, Sabrina received an invitation she hadn't expected. It arrived in a heavy ivory envelope, sealed with a sleek black stamp. Her name was scrawled elegantly across the front. Confused, she opened it to find the gilded lettering of a wedding invitation. Ethan Carter and Emily Langley request the honor of your presence. Sabrina's vision blurred as she read the words again and again. Ethan was getting married. To someone else. Sabrina showed up to the wedding, though she knew she had no right to. Mark hadn't come with her. They'd argued earlier that morning over bills that were overdue, and she had left the house in tears. But it wasn't about Mark. It was about Ethan, about seeing him one last time, about facing the life she could have had. The venue was breathtaking, a sprawling garden estate surrounded by lush greenery and lit with soft fairy lights as the sun began to set. Guests in tailored suits and flowing gowns mingled on the lawn, their laughter carrying through the cool evening air. Everything about it was polished, perfect, otherworldly. And there, at the far end of the garden, stood Ethan. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit him like it had been made for no one else. He looked calm, poised, and confident, the same Ethan she had known, yet somehow transformed. There was no trace of the man she had dismissed. This man belonged here, among wealth and power, moving through the world as though he owned it. By his side was Emily, a beautiful woman with a bright smile and kind eyes, her arm tucked delicately into Ethan's. She radiated grace and joy, the kind of woman who seemed to make everything around her a little more golden. Sabrina felt sick as she watched the two of them together, so easy, so natural. A lump rose in her throat. A waiter passed, offering champagne. Sabrina grabbed a glass with shaking hands, trying to steady herself as she watched Ethan greet guests with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, as though sensing her, his gaze drifted across the crowd and landed on her. For a moment, Sabrina froze. Their eyes locked, and she swore the world around them fell silent. Ethan didn't look shocked to see her. He didn't look angry, either. If anything, there was a flicker of recognition, of knowing exactly why she had come. He whispered something to Emily, then excused himself, walking slowly toward her. Each step he took seemed deliberate, his polished shoes quiet against the stone pathway. When he finally stopped a few feet from her, Sabrina's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sabrina." His tone was calm, but his eyes were unreadable. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the champagne flute. I got the invitation," she said, as though it wasn't obvious. I wasn't sure I should come. Yet you did." His words were gentle, but they cut her to the core. He wasn't accusing her, just stating a truth. "I had to see you," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I had to." "To what?" Ethan interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "Apologize? Ask me to come back." Sabrina flinched. I was wrong, Ethan. About everything. I didn't know what I had until I lost it. I didn't know you, not really. I see it now. You were always more than I deserved." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed softly, his expression softening. "You're right. I was." The words hit her like a slap, though he'd said them without malice. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him, seeing the man she had loved, the man she had betrayed, and the man she could never have again. "Ethan, please," she whispered. "I miss you. I made a mistake. If we could just go back, if I could make it right." Ethan shook his head slowly, his voice kind but firm. "You can't." Sabrina broke down, the tears she'd held back spilling freely as she clutched at the words she could never unsay. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought I wanted more. But you were everything." "I was," Ethan agreed softly, his eyes steady. "But that doesn't matter anymore." He paused, glancing toward the woman waiting patiently for him. "I found someone who sees me now, Sabrina. Someone who didn't need to lose me to appreciate what she had." The finality of his words shattered her. Sabrina looked at Ethan one last time, taking in the quiet strength that had always defined him, the strength she had overlooked until it was too late. "Goodbye, Sabrina," he said gently. And with that, he turned and walked back toward Emily, leaving Sabrina alone in the crowd of strangers. She watched as he took Emily's hand, smiling at her in a way that made Sabrina's heart ache. He was happy. Truly happy. And as the music swelled and the guests turned to cheer for the newlyweds, Sabrina knew the truth she'd been avoiding for months. She had gambled everything and lost. There would be no second chances. As she turned and walked away from the wedding, the setting sun cast long shadows across the ground, mirroring the hollow ache in her chest. Ethan's words echoed in her mind, words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. You see it now because you lost it, Sabrina. And that's not love, that's regret. What would you do if you realized too late what you lost? Share your thoughts on Sabrina's choices and Ethan's revenge. Could it have ended differently?